ce moment. Il y a
Non,
un
ouais.
autre.
Avant, il y en avait, les autres, il y en avait deux.
C'est où le musée où il y a le dîner ce soir? C'est à côté ou... Je sais pas. Parce que tu justement. Non, mais ouais.
Non, parce qu'on va commencer, pardon.
Dovevi dircelo più esplicito perché eravamo tutti strafatti del viaggio e quindi ci siamo
Ready?
vacances.
On va... Oui, mais So, hello everybody, hello. Welcome back. I think we start the session even though some people are still having their coffee. My name is Olivier Dessibourg, I'm a science journalist. I've been working for 13 years for a daily newspaper in Geneva, Switzerland, called the Temps. I'm now a freelancer. And when Yves Siama asked me to moderate that session with the title, Protecting the Independence of Staff and Freelance Journalists, Best Practices and Challenges, I first asked myself, but what do we exactly mean by independence? And independence from whom, actually? We might think it's a trivial question, but it's not, especially now that more and more people are moving from staff members to freelancers. And the situation, we will see it, is different for both of them. For staff, for example, that question again might seem trivial, but when we think of the resources in the media getting scarcer, for example, and so maybe the tendency to accept some paid press trip to increase, the question is how to still guarantee the independence of the staff members taking part maybe in those paid press trips. And simply as a staff member, is a journalist totally independent from, for example, his boss, his editor, the owner of the media? And we've seen that, and we'll come back, that at the end, maybe nobody's really independent. For the freelancers, things are a bit different. I'm not going to make a long story long. I'm going to make it short. More and more freelancers because less and less staff position in the medias, less resources as well in the medias to hire stories from the freelancers. So that's more and more freelancers do actually both science journalism and science communication. So the question here is how to guarantee the independence in having those two hats, actually. And what about simply the pressure that the freelancers have to support when the editor, who's hiring the text from those freelancers, puts some pressure on them to change the text, to put the ideas that the editors had, not the freelancer, not the person writing the article. So this is another kind of pressure and maybe impacting the independence. So those are all, some of the questions we'll go through today through this panel. As said just before, the panel before, probably that there is no total and absolute independence. This is probably very unrealistic to reach, but still it's something that all of us science journalists have to work on, have in mind all the time, and at least try to fight for as much as possible. So during this discussion, we'll talk about all those problems, but I would like also to end the discussion with some possible solutions for all of us to go home with. To talk about all these issues, I have the pleasure to welcome 4 distinguished journalists. We have Maryn McKenna from the United States. She's a freelance journalist working for Wired, National Geographic, and The Guardian, amongst others. And she's also a member of the Association of Healthcare Journalists in the US. We have Daniela Ovadia. She's a science ethicist and writer in Italy. We have Benkimoun, health reporter at Le Monde, and also Le Monde's president of the Journalist Society. And finally, we have Mico Tatalovic, whom you've heard of before in a former panel, who is a former editor at New Scientist and just came back from 1 year at the MIT Knight Fellowship in Boston. So I'll give the word to the 4 panelists, and I might first turn to Paul. One can imagine that as a staff member for Le Monde, one of the most prestigious newspapers in the world, you might be the less impacted journalist with the situation of independence. So is that really so? And if not, where would you see your independence wall start to crack first, if I can say that?
Thank you, and hello everybody. Definitely it's easier to keep your independence when you're in a big media compared to a situation of a freelancer because the balance of forces is so uneven with people who commission him or her. So it's easier. That doesn't mean that we're 100% and immune and protected against any attempt to restrain or to modify this independence. But the way I see it, it's first not just the prestige of a media that protects you, it's the way that the staff members, journalists, set a standard for independence. And for instance, in our case, we have majority shareholders who own 3/4 of the capital, and the internal journalist employees and cadres, as well as what is called the Society of Le Monde readers, own 1/4. So we have an uneven balance of forces, capital-wise. But we have, when they arrived, we have signed documents, and we are confident that and persistent in seeing that those documents are respected, that they do not have a say in the content of the editorial content of the newspaper. They don't have the right to propose an article or to try to prevent us from publishing an article. And so far, they arrived in 2010, and it has been respected. But that doesn't mean that we have to rest on our laurels. We have to fight for it, to organize for it, to educate new journalists joining us. And I think this is, we will see that in the later on when we try to see how we can work it out.
Sure, thanks. Maryn, you're on the other side, you're a freelancer. You work in the US where the rules might be a little bit stricter than here in Europe, and you might tell us why. How hard is it actually for you to fight for your independence as a journalist? And maybe how far do you go in that balance between remaining totally strict about this on one side, accepting no compromise, or going the other way, accepting some compromises, maybe not to be blacklisted or not to be left on the side too much? How do you manage that?
So it's interesting to me that you phrase this as a loss of independence, because I think when people in a freelance context find themselves in a conflicted situation, it's not because they're thinking of a loss, but rather because they're thinking of a potential gain that they might gain by taking a trip that's set up by an NGO, because then they'll get access to a situation that they couldn't reach otherwise, or they'll gain more money by writing for a university or for a corporate situation. And of course, all those, especially the pressure, it's impossible to say that anyone is completely insulated from greed, and since as journalists we always want to tell the better story, we also sort of have a greed for going where we can't otherwise go. And the questions of whether and how journalists can avoid those conflicted situations is something that freelancers in the United States are talking about a lot right now. I mean, you mentioned I'm a member of the Association of Healthcare Journalists. I'm actually a 5-term member of the board, and our organization, which is 20 years old, was founded in part to draw harder ethical lines than we thought existed for journalists writing about health and healthcare in the United States. So in order to join the organization, people can only have certain job classifications. They have to agree to a statement of principles. We have ethical guidelines for them. And we also have rules on who we'll accept money for from the organization and who we will accept money for our annual meetings, which means we don't have very good parties most of the time. But in the US, many of the biggest organizations that a freelancer might work for have ethical standards posted for their freelancers. The New York Times does, BuzzFeed does, a number of other magazines and sites do. They may not make them public, but when you sign a contract with them, they will say, you can do this, you can't do that, and so forth. So to make this about myself, I trained in newspapers, and so my personal ethical standards are the ones I was taught as a newspaper reporter, and therefore I think they're rather strict. They might be a little old-fashioned. So I've never done any kind of corporate writing or university writing or sponsored content. My bank account would probably look better if I had, but I haven't, so there's nothing there for me to disclose. But I have on occasion done stories where the initial pitch of the story was that an NGO or an agency had something that they wanted to talk about, and getting to that place, which might be a site in another country or a vaccination campaign or something like that, required you to accept either a trip that they were proposing or a trip that they would program, even if they'd let you pay for it. And the solution in that case was that when they pitched this, I took this to my editor. I said, they would have some control over this. We're not constrained to what they're going to show us, but the only way to get where we want to go for this story is to travel with these people, and what do we do? In one case in particular I can think of, we allowed the NGO to buy the tickets. We reimbursed them down to the penny with receipts, and we put what we would call a shirt tail, a note at the bottom of the story saying that the appointments in this story were arranged by NGO X, but all expenses were paid by the magazine. And I think that at a minimum, what's necessary is that kind of transparency, that the freelancer has to be transparent with their editor, and that the publication has to be transparent with the audience, because it's when you don't disclose as much as possible that you leave a kind of space of uncertainty where other actors who might not have your best interests in mind can make an accusation of conflict against you. And it's no matter how pure you may think your ethics are, it's the appearance of conflict that will probably hurt you the most in the end.
Thank you. We'll come back on that later on. I now turn to Mico. Mico was, as I said, an editor. He's a former editor at New Scientist, so he must have read or corrected many texts of science journalists, external, freelancers mainly, who I'm sure, if we read the new scientist guidelines, were supposed to be totally independent in their writing. So, a simple question, how did you check that? I mean, how can you be sure that a freelancer you hire an article from is actually totally independent on the subject he's writing?
Thank you, Olivier. Yeah, how can you? Well, to be honest, I didn't really always check. And I think if you look at the guidelines, New Scientist, how to write for us, I don't think they actually talk about independence that much. I think it's almost assumed that you, if you're pitching, you will be a journalist, and as a journalist, you will be independent from your sources, and no one's paying for you to write about this. So I think, yeah, I think as an editor, I usually just assume that the journalist who's pitching is an independent one. And I think most of the times, you know, you might have heard of this journalist, you know their name, or you do a quick Google search just to see who they are. And I think most of the times it's kind of fine. And as an editor, I think you learn to recognize sort of, you know, suspicious things, and alarm bells go off. You know, if someone's writing about something and just seems too flattering or something, then you kind of might want to look into it more. But I've been a news editor for almost 8 years. I don't think I've ever really come across a situation where it's clearly, you know, someone was paid by someone to write this. Maybe once or twice there was something like that, but you know, you would want to check with that reporter that they understand what they're doing is wrong, because sometimes people don't really understand. I think lots of science writers are quite young and they come into this not really realizing what journalism is. They don't have the training at the national newspaper. They are freelancers from the beginning, and I think sometimes as an editor, you know, you just want to explain that to them because they don't realize that what they're doing is wrong. But I think most of the times, you know, I haven't really come across that that type of sort of conflict where, you know, someone's sort of paying for you that much. And also, yeah, I don't think, you know, we don't really have strict guidelines, and we don't do kind of like fact checking on that. So, but I think it's, you know, how do you tell? It'd be difficult to tell. Go and prove that someone is, you know, under conflict of interest. So it can be difficult. We have sort of, on occasion, sent people on paid trips and then taken, you know, articles from that. But then, you know, we would kind of say at the end of the article that this trip was paid for by whoever. I think it's only for certain type of articles, usually kind of like a travel log, you know, field notes, rather than proper news reporting. And I think every time we do that, it's kind of like, you know, you don't want to do it, but if you don't have the budget in your, you know, in your newsroom to kind of send people to interesting exotic places, then it's very difficult to say no when someone invites you to go and experience something and they pay for the trip. And if it is an interesting place to go, an interesting topic that you might consider covering anyway, then it's kind of, you know, it's tempting. And I think, certainly I think publications in the UK don't always say no to those sorts of things, but you do kind of declare it, so it's kind of clear to the reader that this might not be fully independent.
We'll come back on it as well. Daniela, you're an ethicist, a science ethicist at the basis, but also dealing with science journalism issues. So how can you translate your work on ethics of science, where the conflicts of interest are not rare, to the world of science journalism?
Yeah, okay. So actually, I am basically a science journalist, but then I went back to research in ethics in recent years because I found a lot of connection between investigative journalism and ethics, and that's why I went back to this, let's say, more theoretical area. And I worked a lot on conflict of interest in how to set up ethical rules for researchers. I worked on a European project for 4 years about this, and I learned a lot about how you can manage this kind of conflict of interest, at least from a theoretical point of view. And I think that sometimes we have to think about models on managing this kind of stuff and learn from other professions that dealt with these issues earlier, years ago. And the first thing I would like to say is I'm not sure that the main issue now for science journalists is really for a freelance that needs to be paid for travel or even editorial stuff. The main issue for most of our colleagues, especially in countries like mine, in Italy, where the market for independent science journalism is very, very, very small, is when you have to survive, you have to wear more than one hat. What Maryn told is nice. I mean, I'm happy that in the United States you could avoid to write for universities and so on. I would say that it's almost impossible in our country. So most of our colleagues, from time to time, and under, let's say, personal values and choices, decided to accept a work here or there that is not, let's say, definable as independent science journalism. So the problem here is how you can deal with conflicts in the same person when you are two different things at the same time. And what I learned from ethics of research is that there are two big models to manage conflict of interest. The first one is called the presumption against. So it's the model that said you can't do any kind of agreement with anyone who offers you something in terms of money, but pay attention also in terms of values and ideology. That means that there are conflicts of interest that are not material ones, that are, let's say, ideological ones. So, of course, the presumption against model is a very good one. You have no conflict at all. Sometimes you don't eat, you don't pay your bills, and so on. So the problem is that even in professions that propose this model, and the first one is the medical research that proposed this model, they just discarded it after a few years because it was just impossible to manage it in this way. So the other model is the presumption for, which means that you have a presumption, but you have to be transparent in disclosing your conflict of interest, and you have to have a sort of framework where there is a kind of peer review of your conflict of interest. And I think this is the most interesting model for us. If we can, in some way, have a set of rules for our work, and if we can involve the framework in which we are working, because the problem is that even if, let's say, we decide a checklist of ethical behaviors for science journalists, freelance, that maybe from time to time also work as communication officers or they write for university. Okay, we have an association and we decide, okay, we will check, because it's a peer review system. We are the Italian association, we check the conflict of interest of our colleagues. Okay, what happens if the publishers are not interested in our judgment? And actually, what happened a 1 year ago, one of our colleagues in our mailing list wrote us a mail saying, I worked for 4 years in a European project on vaccines. I would like to, and now the main Italian newspaper, Corriere della Sera, asked me a piece on this, because I'm an expert in communicating this. But I feel there is a conflict of interest because I researched with public money on this. So we discussed a little bit, and we say, okay, well, you can write it, but just ask them to put your disclosure. The author is also a researcher. And actually, the publisher didn't put the disclosure because they didn't like it. They wanted the piece from her, but they didn't want to disclose any conflict of interest. And this is quite common in our country. So the problem I think that we should start thinking in, let's say, in an ecological environment about conflict of interest, involving also all the stakeholders that are involved in the issue.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for this nice introduction. So at this point of the session, I'd like to actually split it into 4 subsections, if I can say that. First, I'd like to discuss the idea of independence from sources, then independence from hierarchy, we saw that, then independence from all those invitations or gifts we get, and finally, maybe the most important, independence from the financial means. And to make the session a little bit more lively, I'd like you not only to listen, but to read also. Let me explain. I will base those 4 subsections on 2 surveys that have been made in the last years. The first one was a survey made already 5 years ago for the World Conference in Helsinki by an entity. It's a public communication entity called Bird's Eye Communication, I think. And they did a survey on 400 people. Most of them, I think one of them was, half of them was freelancers, science journalists, 25% was staff members, and the rest was actually doing both science communication and freelancing. And they asked many questions about the blurring lines between the roles of science journalists and freelancers and science communicators. And the second source I took is a debate that took place 3 years ago amongst the members of the NASW, the National American Science Writer, National Association of Science Writer in the United States. And they also ran through some case studies. I will show it to you in a minute. And had this same debate actually on the blurring lines between the two hats, science communication and science journalism. So this is the first case study. I ask you to read it. Paul, you can read it here if you want. There's a screen. And for those, I might actually read it for you. As a freelancer for New Scientist magazine, you score a great interview with a rock star scientist. She gives you lots of time, great quotes. The scientist insists that she read the whole story for accuracy. Even though your editor says we generally don't do that, you show her some quotes for fact-checking. She gets upset about the most important one, saying she never said that and threatening to sue you. So you are sure she did say it, but the recorder was already off at the time. She offers some rewording that is not at all what she said and turns the quotes to vanilla. So I'm sure this is a very concrete experience that some of you might have gone through, and the possible, answers, there might be more than 4, but is to stick to the original quote, which is accurate, to change the quote, as the scientists suggest, to avoid possible unpleasantness later, to cut the graph with the quote altogether, or, well, you don't know. So this brings us back to this idea of independence from the sources. I'd like to hear you, especially Mico, because we talked about this before the conference, and you said, at New Scientist, for example, we take no gloves, right? We publish, and we don't discuss.
Yeah, could I just have hands up for number 1 in here? Who would do number 1? Okay, who would do number 2? Number 3? Wow, number 4? How many of you are journalists? Okay, yeah, well, it's very worrying. I would go with number 1. If you're taking notes and you're confident in your notes, you know that that's what they said and that's a key part of the story. You go with that unless you sort of, I don't know, I think if you're confident in your reporting and your journalism, that's what you do. That's what the job of journalist is. I think at New Scientist, before I joined New Scientist, my old company, we had a couple of sort of grants where people who paid us, they wanted to sort of help us select the stories and help us edit the stories, and I was getting really worried about this. So when I was interviewed for a job at New Scientist, I asked them about independence, and they said, this was sacred. This is sacred for us. This is number 1 priority. So that was kind of quite good to hear. And then I remember a couple of times in the newsroom where the marketing person who was involved with selling adverts came over and talked to our news editor, and then he would leave. And I asked the news editor, "Oh, what happened?" And he said, "Oh yeah, they're running some advert about something, and we have a story about that in the same issue." So I said to him, "So what did you say to him?" And he said, "Oh, I told him to fuck off." And this is the sort of attitude that we were kind of lucky enough to have in the newsroom at New Scientist. I think it's still there. That you just don't cross that boundary. It is kind of like you have editorial on one side and adverts on the other, and I think that's quite healthy. I think with something like this, if you're doing journalism, you really I don't think you should kind of change quotes because your sources want you to change them. Imagine if President Trump could change every single quote. And if you went back to him or to your president or whoever ministers you interview and allow them to change quotes, I don't think that would be good journalism. Well, this might apply because you have an entity backing you, but I'm turning now to you, Maryn. Now, everyone has a word with the social networks, website, blogs, etc. So if you mess up with a scientist, she might say, "Don't come back to me ever." And just write what she or he thinks on the blog or on the social networks.
So I think that within this question, there's really two questions embedded. The first is what the journalist's relationship with the source is, and do you want to maintain it? And the second is what is the strength of the standards of the outlet that you're writing for? And that's really not clear in this question. That for me, for most of the magazines that I write for, they have fact-checking standards that are set out at the start of your assignment, and most of them include asking for sound files of your recordings. So if you don't have a sound file or you don't have a transcript from that sound file, and all you have is your written notes, it would depend on whether their fact-checking standards say we will accept written notes without a recording behind them as to whether you could stand this up. You know, and I'm not an editor, so I can't address on how often the editors say that or not. You know, how often editors would support written notes only, and are they verbatim, and what if you don't have a sound file? But the places that I write for, I think, would mostly not accept this situation. They wouldn't consider the quote stood up. Whether in the face of that I would want to maintain my relationship with my source, I think I would say, I am sorry, I believe you said that, and I want the quote to go ahead. But if my editor then didn't back me up, that's a separate question.
So be very strict. Okay, let's move to the second case study. This is a shorter one, coming from the 2013 survey. So a funding organization sponsors a series of newspaper stories. They pick up the subjects and will read your stories before they are published. Your editor agrees. What do you do? And we have the answer of the poll just after that. So maybe to the room, who would agree? It's not specified if you're a freelancer or you're a staff member, but who would still agree because the editor agreed? No one? One? Who would disagree and definitely not do the piece? Most of you. So these are the answers from the poll in 2030. I'm pretty sure, I mean, it's still valid. We still have 1/3 of the people. Let's remember the poll was mainly on freelancers, right? So people, you know, struggling to make a living and to have their article published. So still 1/3 would accept to do that because their editor agrees. So this brings us back to the question of the pressure some editors or media owners can put on you, especially now that there are more and more sponsored stories, native articles, etc. So again, for example, you at Le Monde, how do you deal with such issues?
So when we have a situation of what we call partnership, that means we have a sponsor, and for instance, we have part of our website is called Le Monde Afrique, there's specifically on Africa, and they are running a series with field work and field report. And for instance, we've done that with Unitaid or things like that, or this kind of organizations. The rule for all partnerships is clear. We accept them, but they have no right to see the articles, or even if we do something in print, the summary of for instance, a special section of 4 pages, we don't send the summary. This is the policy, so no say in editorial content.
Sure, but if your boss says, okay, let's show them, what do you do? Because in times where each media is struggling also for resources, you might be scared to lose your job, for example. I don't know if you say no.
Yes, but if we say yes, that means that we're losing our main and most important value is our credibility, and if we start to adapt more and more, at the end of the day we will lose our credibility and also money. So this is really the line that we shouldn't cross.
To add something?
Yeah. Yeah, I think these case studies are interesting because one of the things that I learned from practicing ethics is that you can set a general rule, but then ethics is putting the rule in reality, and each case is a case in itself. So you're never able to have a general rule that will apply to any kind of case story. So here it's vague for me, because which kind of funding organization? Is this a non-profit organization? I can tell you that I had this same situation because I often work for the Italian Cancer Research Association, which is a non-profit collecting money from the general public to fund cancer research in Italy. It's one of the biggest non-profit organization. And of course, they also work with newspaper because they have an agenda, which is to make people aware of the dangers of not preventing cancer. So is this the same case if I have, let's say, a pesticide industry wanting people to be happy of glyphosate behind their countryside? Not at all. So you can't, I think, and even about the reading before, what means reading with the right to change something, or reading because they just want to read it because they want to fact check? Because maybe you did some mistakes and they are experts. So again, I think that do not transform ethics into a religion, because this is something that we often have in my country. You go in bioethical committees and you have a priest that always have a single answer for any kind of ethical problem you have. No compromise, no nuances, but ethics is never a single answer.
So time is passing quickly. Let's move to this case number 3. This one is a bit longer again. I'll read it for you. You're working on a story for National Geographic about an important archaeological find made in a remote area and an impoverished country, whose government has offered significant support for a return expedition to excavate it. You go on the return expedition with the scientists, during which you and team members contract leishmaniasis, a serious disease transmitted by a sandfly. If news of this development gets out, it could damage the government's attempt to turn the region into an ecotourist attraction and boost the sagging economy. So, do you write about the leishmaniasis in your story? First, no, because it's secondary to the real story about the archaeological find and the plans for ecotourism. I don't want to alienate the government which paid for the expedition. Second, yes, because the outbreak is relevant and it would be wrong for the government's interest to take priority. And third, yes, but you give the government ample opportunity to respond. So you see it. This brings us to the link that is established once you get an invitation for a free press trip. Actually, I would like to hear from all of you here, the freelance and the staff member, what are the rules to accept trips, when and where maybe. I had this personal experience of going once to a press trip with ESA, so the space agency, to Kourou in French Guiana, and meeting there a good colleague of mine, Sylvestre Huet, for Libération at the time, and he said me, no, I didn't take the ESA flight like you, I don't take part in the same group as you, I came here by myself because we want to keep really strict independence. Well, still, ESA is a public funding entity by European money. Getting to Kourou, French Guiana, in the middle of the jungle is not that easy. The interest of the reader is to read about space and satellites, so not really like GMOs or so. So one can ask oneself, what are the criteria to accept or not a press trip like this, for example?
Okay, I'll start. The most simple case is when you have no other means to go to an area where you have to report and say, okay, like for instance, when I took such a trip after the tsunami in 2004, and we had the means to pay for an helicopter trip and things like that. So you do with it. But you have to be transparent about it and under which conditions you've done it. We also had discussions within the staff and with our editor about the fact that there were discrepancies regarding the different sections in the newspaper, where in in some we would refuse. For instance, the medical section, would refuse to be invited to a medical congress by a farmer, and others were, there was different rules applied, for instance in culture section, where people would go to see a concert of a group touring around the world, just to have the article published beforehand, before the group comes to France. So we discussed that, and it was agreed that the most important thing is to be transparent. You may accept under conditions, because otherwise it would be hard to cover. The bar is lower than you can do it without. You can do without, but you have to say it. And for instance, now we have a mention for the tourism, lifestyle and tourism, to explain that this trip was organized by and with. So this is a mention we have, and we have it both on, in print and online, of course.
It's interesting that you come on the question of transparency, because my next slide is a case study on the same issue from the 2013 poll. The question is shorter here, and I don't have it with me. So yeah, you took a trip with all expenses paid by a subject. Back home, you write a piece for a newspaper. The question is, what do? You just tell your editor, but not the readers. And yes, I tell my readers. And it's interesting to see that only half of the 400 people participating in the poll would say, yes, I would tell the readers. And I remember from this debate in 2013 that the reason why, one of the reasons why, was that it could be badly understood by the readers to read at the end of the article, this trip was paid by any entity. Although any intelligent reader would also, could also think, okay, the journalist is intelligent and I trust him in choosing the information, although he has been invited to this trip. So for a freelancer, I understand that from your point of view as a staff member, for a freelancer, if you have very few chances to go on press trips. So how do you deal with that?
So I may not be the best person to ask, because I am a public health reporter, and so those sort of places I'm going that would be essentially paid for by an NGO or an agency or something like, I actually did cover the tsunami as well in 2005, and if you land at a remote airport and someone from the CDC pulls up and says, get in the Jeep, we're going to the coast, you are not going to stand there and call a taxi, because you're too pure to get in the Jeep. You're going to get in the Jeep and figure out how to admit to that transparency later. But I would like to think that's not the same ethical category as someone in the lifestyle section taking a fortnight, all expenses paid trip through Parma to write about, wine and the production of prosciutto. Maybe I only think that because I'm envious of the lifestyle reporters, and no one has ever offered me a 2-week trip to Parma. If anyone would like to, let's speak afterward. I'll turn you down, but I'd still like to hear the offer. I know how the leishmaniasis example ended, because that wasn't a hypothetical, it's a real life situation. Do you want to know what happened?
Yes.
Okay, so that was that trip and the outbreak are the subject of the recent book, The Lost City of the Monkey God, I think that's what it's called, by Douglas Preston. He was a writer who went with several ground imaging, I guess they're called archaeologists, to excavate in Guatemala, and they found this amazing lost city complex, and they also got gravely ill with leishmaniasis, and what they ended up doing was making National Geographic, and then subsequently the author, decided to make the leishmaniasis outbreak kind of the lead of their stories. And I know this in part because National Geographic had me interview them for a news story. They also did a cover story in the magazine, and then it was the subject of a book. So they definitely, they made a point of the disease happening, but I don't think they blamed the government for it. So they may have split the issue down the middle.
When we were preparing this talk, Paul, we were talking about this crazy idea of auto-evaluation, thinking that we as journalists might always best person to think, okay, I'm accepting this, but still I'm remaining totally independent, etc. And you said to me, no, this is total fallacy. This is totally wrong. Why?
Well, I happen to be a medical doctor by trade before turning into a journalist. And during the years I practiced, and of course after, when I was as an observer to this medical world, it's the corruption starts not just because we see big scandals and big money. It starts with a pen, with post-it, with a meal, things like that. It's a very low profile, not aggressive strategy. And you would hear, and I'm familiar with those medical doctors saying, well, I know where the limit is. I know how to control this. Just like an addict would say, I know how to control my consumption. But actually it doesn't work because, when I shift from medical world to journalism world, the same lines would come again. Say, well, I know where to make a difference when I'm talking with the pharma company and giving advice to them, and when I'm speaking, for instance, for the government and giving advice to it. So never trust yourself for that. Trust yourself for finding good stories, but not for regulation of conflicts of interest.
Let's turn now to the fourth and last case study, a longer one again. Sorry for that. Let me read it to you. So, you're a freelancer, science journalist, but you make roughly a quarter of your income from non-journalistic writing, which includes writing brochures for public agencies like NIH and doing copywriting for non-profits like the Institute of Medicine. You avoid taking assignments that are close to the same kinds of articles you write for journalistic outlets. So, are you a compromised journalist? Yes, because your sponsored work is pure public relation and there might be some overlap with your journalistic output, no matter how careful you try to be. Second, yes, but it's okay because spending 5% of your time on a branded content that yields 25% of your incomes frees up time for you to spend on more ambitious projects that are less lucrative but more rewarding. And three, no, because it's possible to separate your journalist outputs from your branded content and public relations work. So here I think we are at the core of the session. Today's session is this area where freelancers have to do both, to have two hats, work as a science journalist for independent medias, but also sometimes do some consulting for PIOs or for communication offices. So I have a general questions to all of you. What are the rules that we could set today to say, okay, what is allowed, what is not? How to actually make those areas less gray than they might actually seem?
Okay, so yeah, I think it's a problem. I don't think that any of these answers is the right one, actually. What I can say is that I wouldn't say that you are compromised, which is a strange term in general. I would say that you have a big problem, which doesn't mean that you can't cope with it, but you need something external to help you to cope with. And what has been invented in other professions is, just to give it, never rely on yourself on conflict of interest. I totally agree. Nonetheless, there are some tools that can be useful. For researchers, I developed many personal checklists. That means that you evaluate your values. Then, of course, is your consciousness. I do say consciousness. Yeah. Your values, you have, of course, to auto-evaluate yourself when you do both jobs for each article you write, for each client you are writing for, and this is the first thing. The other thing is prioritizing values, because we are talking of everything all together. Another thing that ethics do is to prioritize values. Not all the values are on the same level of importance. Just to give you an example, the one with leishmania, I mean, this is not the right case because human lives are involved. So as a human being, but also as a journalist with an ethics behind me, I would say that anything that involves health threatened for human beings is, of course, much more important than any other thing. And the second thing is anything that involves a human rights violation. We have many, even let's say data protection or whatever, you can have many kind of human rights violation is more important than any problem with financing. So don't put all the values on the same level, try to put them on, prioritize them. Maybe we should work together to prioritize our values in our job. What are the most important one? To protect the citizenship, to protect our reader? Do we have a role in helping our citizens to understand how important some issues are? Do we have to protect them against power? This is also another value. Do we have to protect them from, let's say, financial power? This is another important value we can decide it's on the top of everything. So I think we need to start thinking about all this topic in a totally different way, which is not, let's put a rule. No, let's discuss, let's prioritize, let's find a way, let's produce checklists that can help us to deal one by one with our idea of how our job has to be done in the proper way.
Oh, I'm going to be the boring absolutist here. I'm sorry, I think I'm fulfilling a stereotype of Americans, which is that we see things in black and white and we are intolerant of nuance. So my intolerance of nuance is that for myself as a freelancer, and the editors I work for, you know, might have other rules, I would have to go with one. I can't see any way in which I would not be conflicted or give the appearance of conflict by doing PR for something and then writing journalistically about something. Now, and so I would have to forego the income. Now, does that mean that, to take US federal agencies as an example, you couldn't write public relations about, say, the FDA and yet write journalistically about the CDC? Maybe those are far enough apart, but I don't see any way that you can walk both sides of the street about what's effectively a single client. And I think people have this conversation in the US a lot about, I mean, I see it on, you know, on discussion boards and listservs of journalists. I wrote a white paper or I wrote a press release about something that University X did. Can I then write a story about research that University X has done? And what people say back to those people in a fairly nuanced manner is, well, you know, is it the same researchers? Is it the same department? Is it the same school in the university? Do you feel you're conflicted if you write anything about that university at all? Can you never write about that university? I think people are trying to have nuanced conversations about this, but to write about the thing that you've already been paid to write about is definitely out.
So you come back to the role of the editor, Mico. Is that the role of the editor to really verify that the freelancer, I'm coming back again with my same question as before, but should you do that more now?
My position was made redundant, so that tells you how important the role of editors is. Yeah, I think we're having fewer editors, fewer fact checkers. I don't know, I think in this case, I'd probably go with number 3, because you know, if you're not writing about health, then it's not really a conflict of interest, because you're writing about environment and you're getting PR work in health. I think that's fine. And actually at New Scientist, we used to have someone who worked there that she worked for the Department of Energy in the US, and she wrote stories about sort of wild animals for us. I mean, there was no real conflict of interest there. And then later on, she moved into journalism. So I think we have to be flexible these days. And I think, I mean, the only reason we're talking about this is because media can't really pay anymore. We have the problem of business model in the media. I think if that wasn't the case, we wouldn't be talking about this, because then it would be black and white and we wouldn't want to be doing stuff like this. But I think the reality is that lots of people do. And then, you know, how do we balance that? I don't think it's about rules. So you're asking us about setting rules. I don't think we need to set rules, and then who's going to enforce those rules. I think it's more about, yeah, just kind of transparency and personal responsibility and telling your readers and editors about possible conflicts. But I think one conflict that we kind of glossed over is the really conflict with sources, because I think, and it's a bigger issue as well. So if you look at online sort of, Science Daily or Eureka Alert, they all call themselves, your source of latest science or research news. So they all kind of, sound like they're independent news, but they're not. They're just kind of press releases, right? And they're press releases written by sources about themselves. Then you have the Conversation, which is this kind of global now publication that does really interesting work, but basically they get universities to pay membership to be part of the Conversation, and then those universities provide academics to write stories about their work. So they're kind of paying to be published, they're paying to write about themselves. And that's fine if that's what you call it, but the Conversation editors keep calling it journalism, new type of journalism, which I completely disagree with. That's not journalism. If I pay you to write about myself and I write the article about how great I am, I'm not going to call that journalism. So I think, but this is the bigger kind of thing that's happening, and the stuff that we're discussing here, it's really about the ethics of each one of us and freelancers, and I think in a sense it's a smaller drop in the bigger ocean of what's happening in general to media and to public reading the news, because I think a lot of people now reading the news, science news, will read the press releases. They will not even realize that they're reading press releases, and there's huge amount of money going into these sites and magazines that are funded by sources, and they write about themselves, and that's not journalism.
So we now have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the room, so I'll be happy to take some. There's one in the middle. Oh, Eve. Oh, well. Up there in the middle in red. Yes?
Hi, my name is Sadir. I'm a freelancer in Finland. Thank you for an interesting discussion. What I wanted to ask about is, I think all of you at some point mentioned the issue of perception, but most of the discussion was about how we manage our own potential conflicts of interest. I think the question of perception becomes interesting because several of you said that publications don't necessarily want a disclosure statement because that can actually increase the perception of a conflict of interest. And then at the end, Mico was mentioning a lot of press releases that kind of masquerade as news sources. So how do you think we manage the perception side of this equation? What do you think the solution is there to get a better conception from the audience of when there is and isn't a conflict?
I think it's a very interesting question, because I think that the public perception on conflict of interest mostly comes from our job. I mean, we wrote about conflict of interest in other professions, especially in science, on magazines and newspapers all over the world. And the way people perceive conflict of interest is also influenced by the way we wrote about conflict of interest in science and research. So in some way we have to cope with what we did in the past. And I think we should really think all together. I think that mostly me too, I mean, we wrote about conflict of interest following the, let's say, the against model. I also did it because most of us worked as investigative journalists, so our approach is that conflict of interest in the other profession is always bad. Then, when we started discussing conflict of interest in our own profession, then we started to realize that things are in areas of gray. And so I think that now we have to have a public discussion on what a conflict of interest is, because in different fields it can be totally different. And so again, I think we should work on this. It doesn't mean that the against model is a bad one for the general public. Maybe it's the good one, because it's a protection for democracy in some way. But it has some reflection on our job too. So I would say we have to think about it.
I think if you can afford it as a freelancer, take a hard line and don't take paid trips and just be very, old-fashioned. And I think as a media organization as well, if you can afford it, if you can, afford not to do it, I think it's better. So I think you want to kind of project that you are independent and you have to build that credibility over a long period of time. The trouble is it really takes a long time to build that sort of credibility, and it's really easy to kind of destroy it with sort of, one grant or one funded trip or whatever. So yeah, I guess it depends whether your question is about freelancer or a media organization. And again, it's very difficult because you could be really kind of, building this perception of yourself as a great independent freelancer. But if everyone else in this room is doing that, the public is still going to think of science journalists as being, non-independent, right? And if you look at the sort of people's trust in the media and journalists, I mean, it's really low down. So like only 10% trust them. So it's kind of tough.
So Yves, then Terry, and then.
So I would just like to hear the panel's views on the issue of disclosure. Because in the field of medical sciences, for example, one of the first ways to respond to conflict of interest has been to say, okay, we'll accept people in conflict of interest, but we want them to disclose it. And I'm surprised that in our profession, this discussion just doesn't start. So should we, for example, should our associations set up structures, internet databases, something where we could disclose our own conflicts of interest and just make them public if we can't avoid them? Is that something that we should discuss?
Paul?
Well, we have started this discussion within the Society of Le Monde Journalists, and it was in the frame we have regular meetings of the staff convened by the society, which is not a union, but one of its mission is to protect and strive for the independence of our media, Le Monde, and our journalists. And we started within a more general discussion about what we're doing and our rules, our ethic rules. And we said we should open the discussion and consider for all journalists at Le Monde to have disclosure of interests, public disclosure of interests. This first thing I have to say, I have experienced a great, as we say in French, a great moment of solitude, because there were some colleagues saying, okay, yeah, I support this view, but there were something that was really reluctancy from expressed by either on the principle itself, saying we're not paid by public money and we have no mandate like a member of parliament or whatever. And others would say, well, to which extent will it go? It will be intrusive. I don't want to say what my husband or wife or whatever is doing as a profession and so on. So we are keeping this discussion. We are going to start it again. And we have, in parallel to the society, an ethical and deontology committee at Le Monde, which is the president is a lawyer, is some independent personality, and we have also this level of discussion on the principles and why this could be a great tool to prevent conflicts of interest.
What about freelancers, Maryn? Would a website with all the disclosures for each freelancer where editors could go to verify who you work for in the field, if you did in the field of science communication, or any disclosure that you'd make, would such a website help you to get more, editors hiring your articles, do you think?
Sorry. I think this is a little too theoretical for me to respond. Because if it's a question of who have you worked for, I already disclose all that on my website. If I had made, but it's all just journalism. If the proposal is, if you're the sort of journalist who also does sponsored content or branded or something like that, would you list that? Possibly. If the question is, are you disclosing, would you be conflicted because members of your family do X, Y, Z, then there's a privacy consideration of other people that might be overriding your your personal need to disclose? I don't know, I would need more detail, I think, to respond usefully.
Sure, we're coming out of time. So 3 questions, one there, one at the back, and one Terry. Please ask them all together, and we'll pick them. Please be short so that we have time. I'll start with the lady there. She asked first, and then Terry, and then here. Please.
Do you think that we shame each other over this issue, that there's sort of shaming going on? And if so, is that a good thing in encouraging us to act as a body to increase public trust in journalism? Or is it a bad thing in making us want to hide any kind of grey areas that we might have?
Okay, Terry.
So my question is about the distinction between a conflict of interest, the potential for a conflict of interest, and an actual conflict of interest, which I think goes to your point about disclosure of interests. You can have a potential conflict of interest without actually having one. I mean, there is actually, in pure governance terms, and I think we do ourselves a disfavor. I'm speaking as a former chief political correspondent here for a national wire service. We do ourselves a disservice if we don't make that distinction. Not everything is a conflict of interest. There may be a potential, but if you disclose it, it becomes not a conflict of interest, because you're allowing the reader to make their own judgment. And that, I think, is the really disturbing point for me about quite a lot of this discussion. We forget the reader. Journalism is about finding the story, and at some point you have to make compromises in order to be able to get that story. Yes, I understand you want to be able to be pure, but if it means you miss the story, what's the point?
Thank you. And the last remark or question?
Yeah, so it was a remark around, I think it was the first case study, in fact, about the researcher who wanted to review and change the quote. So I wear 2 hats. I'm a researcher in my main job, but I also do some journalist stuff on the side. And so my research has been featured mainly in a variety of forms, but my journalism I do is purely radio-based, audio-based. And so when on the radio aspect, if you've got, then you've always got a recording, right? So I've never, on 1 or 2 occasions, I've had someone who said, I need to check with my comms department if we're allowed to talk about that yet, for example. But I've never had anyone come back and say, we want to check the audio and then change it. But I have had really successful relationships with journalists where they've interviewed me about research and they run it past me because they want to get their facts right. And I think that's perfectly healthy for a journalist who doesn't have the background in that domain, but has the expertise in making it palatable for an audience, to run it past the person who's got the expertise in order to check it. For me, that's a sensible thing to do, and I'm not really sure why people would be against that happening.
Thank you very much. I'll take the very last answer to the question of do we shame ourselves? Who would like to take this one? And that's going to be the final words. Paul and Maryn.
As Daniela has said earlier, you have rules and then you have the real life and how you apply or enforce rules. The point you're raising is the accuracy of what you've done when you're not an expert in the field you're writing on, which happens most of the time. So the policy we have in the science and medicine section is to say we show only the quotes, not the article in its full length, and we send the quotes. This is a different discussion whether there are mistakes because you put milligrams instead of micrograms, for instance. And other than this, if it's about I didn't say that or I say that, it's a completely different discussion. And you have to identify on the spot when you're doing the interview. For instance, when you turned off your tape recorder, to say, well, can I quote you on this, or just because if something is big, well, you should know.
In fact, it wasn't about the quotes, it was more about the scientific accuracy of the story, not specifically the quotes of the researcher.
So we won't do that discussion now. Thank you very much to all of you. We're running out of time. Big round of applause for our speakers, please. And place to the next session.